It is a great pleasure to rise in this House today to speak to this concurrence motion on the grave situation before us in Ukraine. As my constituents in Saskatoon West know, that I sit on the House of Commons Immigration Committee. On this committee, we've been focused on several issues of importance, none more so than the horrid war in Eastern Europe and the humanitarian crisis being caused by Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. The motion we're debating today is very simple. The Immigration Committee came together under the leadership of my colleague, the Conservative Shadow Minister for Immigration, and asked the government to take in Ukrainians visa-free. Simple enough, right? Unfortunately, every single Liberal on that committee voted against the motion. I hope today that they will change their minds and support this motion now that it is in front of the entire House of Commons. This motion was born out of the experience of government failures since August 15th last year to help Afghan refugees fleeing the Taliban. We do not want to see a repeat of what has happened with Afghanistan replay here in Ukraine. Indeed, the two issues are very much intertwined, and before I get into detail about Ukraine, I must bring some context out about Afghanistan. None of us in this House asked for the Taliban to wipe out the legitimate government of Afghanistan last August when Joe Biden removed the last of the U.S. troops from that country. Just as none of us in this House asked for Vladimir Putin to invade and wage war in Ukraine, creating the greatest mass exodus of people in Europe since the end of World War II. Yet, here we are. And as one of the most fortunate, blessed countries on the planet, Canada has a role to play and must step up to the plate. If you listen to the government, Canada's response, in the words of the Foreign Minister, would be for Canada to, quote, be a convener of meetings. We would send over a few World War II bazookas and set up a couple of meetings in Ukraine. Of course, that pales in comparison to the Liberal response to the Taliban, a banned terrorist organization in Canada conquering Kabul last year. Marian Monsef, then Liberal leader for women's rights no less, welcomed the Taliban as, quote, her brothers. Madam Speaker, I first want to put some context to this debate on Ukraine today. That context is Afghanistan. When Kabul was falling to the Taliban, our Prime Minister called a vanity election, hoping to get his sought-after pandemic majority. On that day, the world was in crisis, and all the Prime Minister could see was in the mirror was his own vain image. Thousands of Canadian Forces members served in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2014, with a solemn loss of 159 Canadian military personnel. These brave women and men fought to secure basic human rights, such as the ability of girls not to be sold into sexual slavery and instead to go to school. They also fought to eliminate the threat the Taliban posed to the world peace. And of course, it's the Taliban that gave material aid and support to al-Qaeda in planning and executing the 9/11 attacks. Thoroughly embarrassed, the Liberals did promise to bring in 40,000 Afghan refugees. And this included those who helped our forces while they were in country. The program established to bring them over to Canada has been a dismal failure. In 8 months, the program has brought in less than 20% of the eligible number. And most of those brought in are in Canada because of private refugee sponsorship, not through the clumsy, overly bureaucratic Immigration Canada process. Last night, I attended the Afghan Committee and listened to painful stories from Afghanistan. The Taliban hardliners are turning back the clock. Girls have been banned from school after the 6th grade. Women can't even travel on a plane without a male chaperone. And yet, Canada can't get our act together. Here's one example. Friba Rezai from the Women's Leader of Tomorrow. She works with elite women's athletes, and she has 15 female Afghan athletes who have been given full ride scholarships to respected Canadian universities. The Liberals have denied the student visas. Why? Because they're afraid that these women might stay in Canada long term. So Liberals won't allow elite women athletes to study in Canada because they might not return to a regressive Taliban. I guarantee you will not see that headline on CBC News. And today, many potential new refugees are currently in Europe waiting for their go-ahead to IRCC and a plane ticket, but it's not happening. Indeed, Greece, Crete, and other EU nations are getting increasingly impatient with Canada as they bear the cost to house and feed these refugees that are meant for our country. As an MP and Deputy Shadow Minister for Immigration, I'm fortunate enough to have been able to meet with many ambassadors, high commissioners, and consul generals from other regions to discuss Canada's response to the refugee crisis. I had very fruitful discussions with President Biden's Consul General, Boris Johnson's deputy in Ottawa, and the Belgian ambassador I've also met with the High Commissioner from India, Ajay Bisaria, and Bangladesh, Dr. Rahman, to discuss these issues. And I hear one unifying message from the diplomatic corps here in Ottawa: get on with the job and get those refugees settled in Canada. Madam Speaker, I want to turn to the specific motion that we are debating here today. Earlier this month, our committee, led by the Conservatives, supported by the other opposition parties, passed this motion calling upon the government to implement visa-free travel for Ukrainians fleeing Putin's war machine. Unfortunately, Liberal members voted against this motion, going on record with their opposition to allowing Ukrainians coming into Canada. Indeed, the Liberal member from Surrey Newton summed up Liberal opposition to this at the March 1st committee meeting when we were discussing this. This is what he said, I quote, "Liberal members who are concerned about the security, concerned about bad people coming to Canada if there is visa-free entry. This is not going to go well, so please consider that and do not support this motion," end quote. And remember, we're talking about women and children. Men aren't even allowed to leave Ukraine. Honestly, this is just a smokescreen for their government to slow down the process and keep people out. I know this because I asked the Minister of Immigration directly about security concerns for Ukrainians coming into Canada when he came to the committee at the following meeting. Specifically, I asked him if the biosecurity checks that are being done at our embassy in Warsaw, Poland, would add extra processing time to the applications. His answer was that it takes only a few days and added negligible time to process the Ukrainians. This is simply not true. The reality is it's adding up to 6 weeks to the process. It is so bad, in fact, that the Toronto Star reported Polish Prime Minister had to take Canadian media aside during our Prime Minister's trip to Poland to underscore his frustration that these refugees were not being cleared through our embassy in Warsaw. When the Polish Prime Minister needs to complain about the lousy job the Liberals are doing, something is clearly wrong. The Conservative solution is simple. Do the security checks when these individuals arrive in Canada. These are women and children. The risk is very low. What does our Conservative solution accomplish, Madam Speaker? First and foremost, it allows the people fleeing the war zone the opportunity to come to Canada in an expedited manner. Back in Saskatoon, as I talk to people that have family on the ground in Ukraine or Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, or wherever they may be in Europe, the stories they are telling me are of massive delays at Canadian embassies and consulates to get paperwork done. And that paperwork is for visas. It is to get the so-called biometrics done. Basically, it's fingerprinting and criminal record checking, but on a larger scale and against a global database. Conservatives absolutely understand the need to keep undesirables out of Canada. However, we can do these criminal checks in Canada. Remember, we're talking about women and children. Canada can do better. Madam Speaker, on Thursday last week, the Minister of Immigration appeared at our Immigration Committee. I asked him about the dichotomy between the treatment of Afghans and Ukrainians coming into Canada. I wanted to know why only 9,500 of the promised 40,000 Afghan refugees have arrived in Canada after 8 months. I wanted to know why he was also bragging about bringing in over 10,000 white Ukrainians to Canada in only 3 months. The Minister said this back to me, and I will quote, "The vast majority of people who want to seek safe haven in Canada actually will return to the Ukraine." Regarding Afghans, he said, quote, "I hate to admit that the likelihood that people who are coming here are going to be able to return, it's just not there," end quote. So he believes that Afghans will stay in Canada permanently, and on the other hand, he has every confidence that white Ukrainians will have no problem exiting Canada when the time is right. This boggles my mind. He basically admitted in his own systemic biases engaging people by their skin color. I'm not the only person that caught this either. On Friday last week, the Globe and Mail did an entire news story on my exchange with the Minister. This was their analysis. Once again, I'll quote, "Opposition parties say the Liberal government's streamlined immigration program for Ukrainians creates a two-tiered, racialized system that prioritizes Ukrainian immigrants over refugees from the other conflict zones, including Afghanistan. The Immigration Minister added that the government opted to offer streamlined immigration measures to Ukrainians rather than a dedicated refugee program because European counterparts in the Ukrainian-Canadian community have indicated that most Ukrainians who come to Canada will want to eventually return home. This is not the case with people coming from Afghanistan," he said, "hence the need for a refugee program." End quote. Madam Speaker, I can assure my constituents in Saskatoon West, and indeed all Canadians, that can read between these lines and see that the Minister is basically waving the white flag to the Taliban and saying, unlike white Europeans Afghans don't have the drive, desire, or love of their homeland and won't return if conditions improve. Madam Speaker, I've managed many people over the years, and I've learned that the vast majority want to do a good job. And I'm sure that the hardworking staff at IRCC want to make Canada proud and do the best job that they can. But there are clear problems. Both Afghans and Ukrainians are being stalled by bureaucracy and piles of rules that effectively stop good people from coming to Canada. These types of problems fall firmly at the feet of leadership, the Minister and his senior staff. I urge the Minister to review this bureaucracy and make immediate changes so that IRCC can do the work they want to do and make Canada proud. Madam Speaker, Marcel from Saskatoon West wrote to me after that Globe and Mail article was published, and I want you to know what he said because it's relevant to today's debate, and I quote, "Thank you for raising this issue. I complained at election time that it was criminal that getting Afghanis who helped the Canadian forces have been delayed by the bureaucrats and the Liberals. Today's paper states about half those approved are still being kept out. We should charter planes to bring them here and do the paperwork later. All those who help the Canadians can be identified by past and present members of the forces," end quote. Marcel's point was that the Afghans we are trying to get out helped us through the two-decade war. Canada was in that war because we're part of NATO, and the U.S. invoked Clause 5, which ensures mutual defense. When one NATO member is attacked, we're all attacked. What is happening in Ukraine has a lot of people talking about NATO and Canada's role within NATO. The people in Saskatoon West are asking me what I believe we should be done for our defense posture and our budget. And to that end, I put a motion on notice in this House just last week, Madam Speaker. Motion 55 reads as follows: that given the ongoing war of aggression in Ukraine and the possibility of war spilling over into NATO-defended territory, in the opinion of the House, the government should, A, make at minimum the NATO requirement of defense spending investments of 2% of GDP in Budget 2022 to bring the budget of the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces into line with NATO requirements. B, focus this funding on expanding Canada's war-fighting capabilities. C, authorize the Departments of Public Works and Government Services and National Defence to make capital purchases for the Canadian Armed Forces on an urgent basis using national security grounds and waiving bureaucratic red tape. And D, immediately enter into an agreement with the United States of America to use Canadian territory for the deployment of its ballistic missile system and provide funding and operational personnel for such a system based within its territory. Now, the first and second part of the motion are pretty straightforward. When our Prime Minister was in Brussels last week, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg told reporters that all member nations had until June to provide their plans to him to reach the NATO target of 2% of GDP for defense spending. Our defense minister immediately left that meeting and shot that idea down. The government's coalition partner, the NDP, have said that they will veto any increased defense spending. So it looks like Canada will once again miss this target. The first part of the motion to cut red tape and authorize the purchase of military equipment on national security grounds is something that has happened since Prime Minister Harper. When Canada needed tanks or new heavy-lift airplanes for the war in Afghanistan, the government invoked the National Security Clause and the equipment arrived within months. Today, when we look at what we can provide for the war in Ukraine, we don't have much. Our military cupboard is nearly bare. When our governments go to buy helicopters, fighter jets, or new naval vessels, it takes decades. The process to start building the new naval frigates started in the early 2000s, and not one plank has been laid. The process to buy the fighter jets started at the same time, and only yesterday did the government announce they will begin the process to buy the planes that Harper wanted to buy in 2006. And what about those helicopters? Yes, the ones that Brian Mulroney ordered in the 80s and were canceled by John Chrétien. Then they were reordered and finally arrived only a few years ago. Unfortunately, they're all out of service because of cracks in the airframe. But hey, that's the government red tape military procurement system for you. The final section I have in there is Canada joining the U.S. ballistic missile defense system. Do you know that Canada is the only NATO country not protected against Russian nuclear attack? The technology in this system is proven to shoot down incoming ICBMs. It won't catch all the nuclear warheads, but it will certainly limit the damage. So why isn't Canada a member? The Americans were willing to pay and man the system after all. All we needed to do was allow them to set up some stations in our Arctic territories. Because under the Paul Martin Liberals in 2005, Canada told President Bush that we thought Putin was a nice guy and would never harm a fly. What I'm proposing is that we get back to the Americans, tell them Canada made a mistake, and that if we need to pay and man the stations in the Arctic, a real partnership with the USA, we will do it. Madam Speaker, even with the war in Ukraine, I'm not under any delusion that the NDP Liberal government will support this motion. But I want my constituents back in Saskatoon West to know that I'm putting these ideas forward for them. Madam Speaker, Saskatoon has one of the highest Ukrainian diaspora populations on the planet. After Ukraine and Russia, the Canadian prairies is the home to the world's third largest Ukrainian population. I grew up behind the Garlic Curtain in Yorkton, Saskatchewan. The Yorkton area has a very large Ukrainian population, which is why I thought that garlic was one of the food groups. Borscht, pierogi, halapshi, all I ate very well in Yorkton. And I recently learned that my own ancestry is tied to Ukraine. My heritage is Mennonite. My Mennonites started out in Netherlands, then they moved to Prussia, and then they were enticed to move to Russia by Catherine the Great. She offered them freedom in exchange for their work developing vast farms because they were known as great farmers. My grandfather always called himself Russian and labeled his town of birth as Schönfeld, Russia. However, what I recently learned was that my grandfather was actually born in Ukraine. His birthplace, while called Russia at the time, was actually very near Zaporizhia, the heart of the current fighting in southern Ukraine. I finally understood my love of Ukrainian food and of Ukrainian people. Many Ukrainians also live in Saskatoon West. Their families came here when our province was first settled and the government was providing land to be farmed. Many others had grandparents and parents flee to Canada during the Holodomor, Stalin's Holocaust and mass starvation of the Ukrainian people. And even today, there are many Ukrainians who are immigrating right now. The Ukrainian language is very much alive and well in Saskatoon. And I've had a chance to talk and meet many constituents of Ukrainian descent over the past several years and talk about issues common to all Canadians. We talk about taxes, government spending, inflation is a hot topic right now, healthcare, the pandemic, crime, and everything in between. It's only been recently, though, that we've been talking about the old country and their relations and ties that they have back in Ukraine. It's heartbreaking to listen to the stories they relay from the front lines. It's also heartwarming to know that many of them are prepared to do everything possible to support Ukraine against Putin's war of aggression. Even in Saskatoon, I've spoken with young men who couldn't wait to find a flight to get back to Ukraine to help fight against Putin. Alexander from my riding wrote to me and he said the following, quote, "Hi Brad, I'm a Ukrainian immigrant. I'm in Saskatoon since 2006. I'm glad to meet with you, though I am just a journeyman welder in Canada, former Ukrainian engineer, resident of Saskatoon. I'm not a leader of a community or anything like this, so you don't really need me other than to learn from me about this ridiculous fact of this old, vicious attack against Ukraine." Alexander's letter told me that he wanted to send money, a money wire transfer, back to his family. But because of the policies of the Liberal government in Ottawa, he was barred from doing so. This is just another example of the Liberals making bureaucracy a priority over the people of Ukraine. What I will tell Alexander and all my constituents is that I'm in Ottawa and I will continue to fight for you and will continue to stand up against this incompetent Liberal government to ensure that the concerns of Ukrainians are heard. Madam Speaker, I don't know what the future holds for Ukraine and Afghanistan. I fear that in both instances, it will not be good. Democracy and human rights may once again prevail in both countries, but the human cost will be high. What is Canada's responsibility to make sure this happens? We fought a war in Afghanistan and a lot of Canadian blood was spilled and treasure spent. In Ukraine, the stakes are even higher. Reports put daily military casualties higher than the entire wars inflicted on the USA and NATO allies in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2 decades. The belligerents of Russia and Belarus directly border NATO countries, while NATO supply lines of military equipment into Ukraine become legitimate targets for our attack. President Biden said the following, and I quote, "A direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is World War III, and something we must strive to prevent," end quote. Those are scary words for sure, Madam Speaker. So let me finish with these inspirational words from Ukrainian President Zelensky when he addressed Parliament just 2 weeks ago. Quote, "We're not asking for much. We're asking for justice, for real support which will help us to prevail, to defend, to save lives all over the world. Please expand your efforts to bring back peace in our peaceful country. I believe and I know that you can do it. Inspirational words, let's heed them. Peace to Ukraine, Slava Ukraini.
Comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to emphasize that there has been a very much a Team Canada approach in dealing with the crisis that we're seeing in Europe today, in particular in Ukraine. Whether it's Canadians or provinces like the province of Quebec, British Columbia, Alberta, all coming, talking about supporting refugees and other discussions that are ongoing. To that extent, it's really quite encouraging. But it's also important that we put on, as much as possible, I would suggest to the member, accurate information. For example, he made reference to 6 weeks processing, when we know the average is actually 2 weeks. That's a substantial difference. And I think that when we take a look at the people that might be following this debate, it's to highlight the fact that Canada, has done exceptionally well. In fact, in 2020, I believe we resettled 1/3 of all refugees worldwide here in Canada. So we have demonstrated leadership in the past. I believe we will continue to demonstrate that leadership. And there is important for us all to recognize that it's 2 weeks, not 6 weeks.
Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
I thank the member for his statement. There may be a number somewhere that says 2 weeks, but my information comes directly from people that we've talked to, that I've talked to, that our office has talked to. It's actually quite fascinating. I was in my office last week, and my office manager was speaking with a woman here who's Ukrainian, who was speaking with her family, and as we're conversing here, she's texting back to her sister, who is in Poland at the time. And it just amazed me that we have the ability to communicate directly with people who are on the front lines of this conflict. And so when I say that it's 6 weeks, that's coming from those people. This is real information that I have from people that I've talked to. So the government may say one thing, but the information that I have seen and that I've heard from people in my constituency and people fleeing the area is that it's many more than 2 weeks.
L'honorable député de Jonquière.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Our colleague for Winnipeg North just said that it's important to present the facts as they are. Earlier, my colleague from Montarville presented numerous facts just as they are. We have not gotten any answer from the government regarding the idea of chartering planes to help refugees get out. Raising visas, some countries have done that within hours. Here, we hear that it's going to take 12 weeks. And visa offices are only open from 8:30 to 4:30. So when it comes to the facts, would my colleague agree that there's a real lack of initiative from the government?
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
I thank my colleague for that question. It's a very good one, and it just points out the reality that's being faced right now. I've heard many stories of people who are wanting to get biometrics, for example, and these biometrics that are supposed to take a short amount of time. They can't even, when they call the office, they don't even have the ability to book an appointment because they're all booked for the next 6+ weeks. So there is a tremendous problem with the immediacy of this issue. And so the idea that my colleague suggests about getting some planes over there, dealing with the paperwork once they come here, as I said in my speech, these are women and children. Men aren't even allowed to leave Ukraine because they're needed in the war effort. And so the risk to Canada is extremely low. And so I strongly believe that we could do things to get people out of the country, get them to a safe spot. Then we can deal with paperwork. Then we can deal with biometrics and figure out if they're terrorists or not.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith. The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Port Moody, Coquitlam.
For Port Moody, Coquitlam, yes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I thank the member for the comments around biometrics. I'm hearing the same thing in the riding of Port Moody, Coquitlam, many families that can't get appointments to get their biometrics. So the NDP condemn these attacks in all measures. It's a terrible humanitarian crisis. And I just wanted to ask the member if they believe that there are resources, sufficient resources to deal with this crisis from our immigration system without impacting other crises that are happening across the world. And if not, some additional examples of how that's impacted their constituents.
Member for Saskatoon West.
I thank the member for that question. It's a great question, and it's one that we've asked multiple times at the Immigration Committee. I hear it from people every day. And the simple reality is when you have a finite amount of resources and you add more work to the pile, something won't get done. That's just reality. It's all of us who have been in the real world have experienced that. We experience that in our own homes. If there's too much to do, something doesn't get done. All of us have a to-do list that we've not gotten to. And so that's the case here too. So I've heard many cases of other streams of immigration. I spoke a lot about Afghanistan. I think that one is falling by the wayside a little bit. Certainly sort of the normal stream of immigration. I can recall a man in my riding who wasn't able to see his wife and kids for 2.5 years because he was waiting for paperwork. Those are the kinds of cases that are going to suffer, I believe, in this. And there are not enough resources to do all of this work all at the same time. But the good news is I believe it could be. I believe if the will was there could be more resources, because ultimately we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to be able to deal with a crisis while we continue maintaining the regular work that has to be done.
Brandon Suri.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I just want to praise my colleague for his excellent presentation and speech here in the House on this matter. One of the things that we have to face is that, there was a poor example of last August, it came to a peak just in the election campaign about how poorly the government did here in regards to immigrating the Afghan refugees or Afghan supporters into Canada at that time. The parallel here is we're in a war again in Ukraine, and I wonder if my colleague could, he just answered a little bit of it in the question in regards to resources. When you're in a war situation like this, and we've got a reasonable presentation like we have as an Opposition Day motion today to open up the visa process to get people here and then deal with the situation so that they can at least find comfort with their family as much as they can back here in Canada. Can he just draw a parallel between that issue of why we need more resources and if they would be available? The government has made funds available for a lot of other things. We've just gone through COVID. We know that government services staff are busy, but can he just expand on his thoughts on how we would deal with the increase in government services opportunities to get these people here?
Member for Saskatoon West.
I thank my colleague for the question. Well, first of all, according to this current government, money doesn't seem to be an object on anything. So I don't think we can say that money's an object. They've found ways to print money, and I'm not suggesting that's a good thing, but it seems to be the mode that they operate in. So I'd be surprised if they said that money was an object. We also have a very large civil service, so I would think that we have the ability to do this. The reality is that the minister, I believe, has the authority to authorize special permits for people to escape if needed, and I think it's been done before. So I think we have the tools that we need to make this happen. I think we have the resources to make it happen, and if we don't have enough resources, I'm quite certain that we could add what we needed to get it done. We have to be able to accomplish these things.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank our colleague for his excellent speech. We need to ensure that this motion is adopted. And we need to ensure that it pushes the government to end once and for all the war of bureaucracy that Ukrainian women, children, and seniors are currently experiencing as they wait, hopefully temporarily, to be able to take refuge here in Canada. So far, we've seen a series of failures. Can Canada, like 91 other countries, can Canada withdraw from the visa obligations? I believe so. What does my colleague think?
West.
I thank the member for her question. Want to comment on a couple things that she raised. One is that this government has a history, and my previous speaker mentioned the same thing. If the idea comes from the opposition, it's not a good idea. And I just want to plead with them that this is a good idea, and please take it, please use it. We're willing to give it to you and let you do whatever you want with it. The other issue that she mentioned was about women, and I just want to highlight that too. We need to make sure that this is primarily right now about women and children. And so we need to protect these women. We need to give them a place to live, a safe place to be. This is hugely traumatic for them and their kids. And so we need to be here for them at this time, and I believe Canada can do that right now.
Debate, the Honourable